Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Aidan Morrison, and I'm just reading his Twitter description here. Labs physicist, entrepreneur, blogger, interested in small bars, small boats, and big data. You run a YouTube channel, Miltech and Tack, I believe. Aidan, you've kind of burst onto the scene, as small and peripheral as it may be on the nuclear side, but I think also in a much bigger way within the Australian context. You have dug up some very interesting information about some of the energy modeling happening in Australia, as exciting as that sounds. But it's gotten picked up. Claire Lehman of Quillette, it's been covered in national media, and I believe I've seen some footage of politicians on the floor, may have been state houses or national parliament, also talking about it. So we're going to get into all that. But first off, why don't you build off of that Twitter bio and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Aidan. I grew up in Tasmania, little island at the bottom of Australia. I now live in Sydney. Studied physics at university, which was great fun. So I actually studied a little bit of nuclear physics, and took small courses in my honours year in nuclear reactor design, but not to become a proper engineer. These were just kind of, the end-on courses in a sort of third, fourth year physics degree. So learned to get to know a little bit about nuclear things then, and then had a totally different career. Started a PhD, which I quit in experimental particle physics, the ATLAS experiment at CERN. Quit that to become an entrepreneur. And so my first big project was in the military tech space, which is why I still sort of have an interest there in the Miltech and Tack channel. Fell into hospitality, actually. Opened a bar restaurant with friends. Then got into a bit of economic and policy analysis for a bit of a change. Learned to code doing that. Became a data scientist. Been doing data scientist and sort of machine learning things. Software engineering, sort of building out things for trading platforms recently. Dipping back into this energy space has been really sort of exciting and sort of kicked off, just from Twitter debates recently. But bit of a mixed background. Quite a mixed background. I'm not a professional in this space by any stretch, but I've just got some skills to be able to think about numbers and data and stuff. So it seems to be working out.
Definitely. Listen, I wanted to start off with, we have quite an international audience, definitely a pretty dedicated following in Australia, but I had the opportunity to travel down, give a speech in Australia, and spend about 12 days. Not really sightseeing. I did see some roos and some wombat poo, which was top priority bucket list for me. But also got to meet with a number of politicians, policymakers, think tank people, and yourself. Had a great night out in the town with you, and that was a lot of fun. For the international listenership, before we get into sort of what you've uncovered and the muckraking that you've done with regards to some of the modeling that is the kind of evidentiary basis for the bold leap that Australia has taken and is planning with further renewables deployments. I wanted to get some of your insights on, again, this context, the country that you're speaking to us from, the continent you're speaking to us from. Just a couple of my own observations that hopefully I get you to riff off of. I was a little surprised. We think of ourselves, I think, as being quite similar. Commonwealth cousins is kind of the moniker I used in the talk. Thank you, Bob Parker, for that. But I think some pretty significant differences. I came away with the sense that Australia is kind of a petrostate of minerals, that still very much, in its economic relationships, a bit of a colony. I guess the joke was colony of the UK, then colony of the US, and now a colony of China. This economic complexity ranking, number 93 out of 133 countries, just above Pakistan, just below Uganda, was pretty surprising to me. Obviously, vastly different GDP per capita, et cetera. These are some of the things that stuck out to me, and frankly have me, a little bit worried about my Commonwealth cousins. So why don't you build off of that introduction slightly? Again, I'm making some comparisons to Canada and Ontario more broadly. Certainly I think the West in general has undergone a fair amount of de-industrialization, with globalization. But we've retained a lot of our economic complexity and our kind of value add. And in Ontario, I'd make an argument that nuclear's been a huge part of that in terms of, pretty robust precision manufacturing industry. and everything that goes into supporting our nuclear industry. So yeah, riff off that. Give some more insights to our international audience and to your Australian brothers and sisters about your take on the quirky country that you're from.
My scathing view of Australia. I mean, Australia is the greatest place to live. It's just great, and the people here are brilliant. But I feel like I'm a sort of tiny little microcosm of what happens in Australia. I studied physics. I got partway through a PhD in experimental particle physics. And my first full-time job was running a coffee shop, making coffee. And I feel like that's a kind of like trite little example. And that was partly by choice, and I was trying to become an entrepreneur at the same time. But we have this thing in Australia where the people you meet and the degree of education they have and the skills they have are brilliant. Like, I think Australia is packed full of brilliant people. And if you look around the world at where you see Australians around the world, it is, I think we're an impressive bunch. And in various things in the arts and sciences, we punch at our weight or higher. But yet there's this weird thing where we don't seem to be able to coalesce that into any kind of industry or institution of excellence that has kind of reached some sort of critical scale or mass, much bigger than like a really good cafe. Like, as in we have the best coffee in the world.
You really do.
Like bar none, right? So, I mean, that's it. So how do we get this kind of extremely, extremely well-educated, cultured, civilized group of people, and our top achievement as a nation is that we're the best place to come and buy, a corner, a great coffee at a corner, at a funky cafe with good people in it, and
yeah.
and that's absolutely saddens me. I mean, there's lots of other. That's a parody, of course. It's there's plenty of good things happening in Australia, but in terms of the giant institutions and the top companies, if you go down the top kind of dozen sort of ASX companies, pretty much we have a couple of big miners, and we have banks selling mortgages to Australians, right? Like, the joke I've heard is that, like, if you look at other countries around the world, they make stuff like Germany and Japan and Korea. They make stuff like ships, electronics, like, cars, and sell it to the world. Australia makes nothing and sells it to Australians. Like, that's what our housing and insurance industry is. And we still manage to be very wealthy because I suppose the services we have, making ourselves our coffees and delivering things and just getting the place to run is overall pretty competently done. There's good people here, and we but in terms of what we are great at, like what's the great Australian export? What's the IKEA or the Panasonic or the Hitachi or the Siemens? What's the Australian heavy hitter? We have none except mining companies, and yeah, that's kind of disappointing.
Rob Parker, we had him on a little while ago. Check out that episode, Avoiding an Energy Blunder Down Under. He talks about the Relic economy, which I thought was a great way to sort of summarize what you said: real estate, law, insurance, and coffee. And yes, I can attest that the coffee was absolutely amazing. We flew back through LA and had some airport coffee. And I mean, I'm not sure if like McCafe in Australia, it's got to be better. I meant to sample it because I'm like, if like the absolute crap coffee, that there should be some sort of like international standard of shittiness. Is way better in Australia than I'm in the Matrix or something.
There was a point in Australia where McCafe actually had this big mea culpa, and they said, like, they ran this national advertising campaign in Australia and said, "We're sorry, our coffee has not been up to scratch. We're going to put extra effort in and retrain our baristas to try to meet the standards that Australians expect."
Well, if I mean, not to get too far off track here, but if they're called baristas in a McCafe, I think that speaks loudly enough. Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Wow.
Yeah, your barista at McCafe is, that's exactly right. So.
Incredible. Yeah, I mean, getting into this kind of economic complexity thing, I mean, I think it's somewhat understandable given the richness of, Australia's minerals and the proximity to shipping, like, just this kind of dig and ship model and the competition, frankly, with North Asia. I understand Australia had a pretty significant auto industry, but to be charitable, I guess it's hard to compete in manufacturing in a globalized world. Do you have any insights into sort of why that has occurred? Australia dropped, I think, 38 places in its economic complexity. Not to harp on that too much, since 1995. Is this just an inevitable result of being close to these highly productive, highly complex Northern Asian states? or is there something else going on?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure fully about the answer to all of that. It's a hell of a question, but I think part of it is car manufacturing is an interesting one. It's sort of been bandied about politics for a while because it is hard to compete. But I've also heard people say that the degree of protection or the degree of subsidy required maybe to keep that industry compared to a whole bunch of other things that you might need to do to kind of nurture or create an industry. Might not have been that high. It's still a protection of sorts and a relatively kind of liberal economic kind of viewpoint. Don't like the idea of it, but yeah, that went offshore. We're a long way from anywhere, and that doesn't matter too much so long as you're putting it on a ship and it's not time critical and it's not that valuable for the time in transit. But developing the more valuable goods. The more valuable the good gets, the more costly in terms of the supply makeup the time in transit becomes. So we're not a good place for intermediate assembly. Things have to come to us, like from, I don't know, other sophisticated places like Europe and America, which is as far away as it gets, and then go back there. That doesn't make us a good intermediate place. In terms of value adding, it's really interesting. I grew up in Tasmania, and Tasmania has amazing hydro, and there's a few more rivers we could dam, but there were big campaigns to save them, and I personally have been my mum grew up in those campaigns. I've got a fairly green kind of background in my family. And those rivers, I love that things like the Franklin River aren't dammed. They're just incredible World Heritage sort of area things. So, but there was a movement. Part of, I think, the Tasmanian polity was this kind of vision for trying to use energy for extra cheap industrialization. Like, I think there was sort of this kind of, Tasmania could be the hydro-powered Ruhr Valley of Australia vision. And there's some smelting that happens in Tasmania, and also I suppose there's been various things about like raw materials extraction improvement. There's a big discussion in Tassie about developing a pulp mill that was very controversial, not far from where I grew up, and that eventually fell apart. After the company put a lot of effort, they pretty much hung themselves out on that one, and bought up all the vineyards, like a beautiful, lovely little area. Bought up a whole bunch of vineyards to try to not have too much resistance to it locally and all that sort of stuff. And eventually, I think the economics didn't quite work out, or they reached out too far, overextended themselves. But those kind of improved manufacture things have always been hard. A lot of it's a bit of conservationism, as in not wanting to develop. And I consider myself a bit of an old school conservationist in the sense that, like, protecting the forests and protecting the landscape and keeping this pristine is important to me. Grew up bushwalking, love it. But I feel like there's an inherent resistance to kind of a big new industrial project that happens in Australia. And I think that's a little bit of what taps into the kind of nuclear space as well, like that inherent kind of like, there's a big new industrial thing that's happening. But yeah, I don't know why we can't do a little bit more or better in that space. I think there's opportunity. I think we should be able to punch a little bit higher than we currently do in terms of advanced manufacturing.
Part of what is interesting about the energy debate is the energy modeling and the plans that are laid out seem to be leading to some pretty eye-watering prices and some real questions about reliability of the grid. And when we look at countries whose economic complexity is even lower than Australia's, a commonality is often that they have an unreliable grid, that they're scourged with blackouts, and that impedes industry. And so the kind of manufacturing that Australia continues to have seems to be at threat from these high prices. And we've seen, the rapid de-industrialization occurring in Germany, for instance, as its energy prices have really gone through the roof. And, even in the minerals sector, when I was invited to speak, I said, what's the motivation here? Because, renewables are great for the mining industry. There's, enormous amount of rare earth minerals and just, steel and iron ore, for instance, that are required. And, you build a few nuclear stations in Australia. Does that have a huge impact on the amount of uranium you mine or your customers there? It's such a small part of the running a nuclear power plant. And my sense was it's because even the mining industry is starting to be a bit concerned about the reliability of the grid and the cost of electricity in Australia, consuming something like 10% of Australia's electricity. So I'm trying to, I guess, poke a little bit at what motivated your interest in energy, but any thoughts you have there in terms of, whether Australia's economic complexity is going to fall even further, or whether there can be, de-industrialization of the industry that still remains as a result of energy policy.
No, I don't actually think so, because I don't know whether we have much discretionary industry that has somewhere else to go. Like, I think the industry we have is making stuff that we kind of need here that's too expensive to get. Like, there's a certain amount of things like bricks, right? We have brick-making companies, and their energy is gas, right? So there's always a bit of a hoo-ha about when gas prices go up. But I don't think it's realistic. I mean, maybe it is. Who knows? Shipping's pretty cheap. Maybe it is realistic to ship bricks, but you can see why you wouldn't want to do that, right? So, so these things actually, like, the industry will cry out and scream and shout a little bit, and prices will probably go up, and the rest of Australians might just pay more for stuff that probably has to get made here. I don't know whether we have really that much industry that could be made anywhere, and Australia's the best place for it, except in like very, very, there are specialty tech sectors, but in terms of things that have kind of scale and big inputs and big material inputs and like cars or bulky manufactured goods, I don't know. I don't know we have much left to lose. Is kind of one way of saying that. And the other thing is, as far as the mining and production goes, that's really interesting. They have huge advantages in terms of, like, the quality of the ore that we have at certain places is just great. Like, the best iron ore in the world, bar none, is in Australia, and we're closer to Asia than Brazil. So, we just have a massive lead there. We're not close to being pipped off number one. But you could muck that up, right? These huge scale industrial processes are fine-tuned to be the most efficient they can be. A few blackouts and not having reliable power, I'm sure, would be a pretty serious issue for them. So maybe we can lose that. The other thing, but the industry kind of that Australia never has, right, or is struggling to have, for example, is making steel, which is tiny compared to the amount of coal, including coking coal and iron ore we export. And we have this other weird geographic problem where all the really good iron ore is on one side of our country and all the really good coking coal is on the other side of the country. And our unions won't let us ship iron ore around the country, right? That's basically prohibited. So we can't combine our world-class iron and world-class coal into making world-class steel. Because of labour arrangements, basically. So that's impossible. So energy is not a critical input. But anyway, that's kind of the predicament Australia's in. And like building a railway line that's 3,000 kilometres long across the middle is, maybe, but not really likely. But so yeah, that's where I don't know we have much to lose actually right now. But things would get way more expensive for Australia. We just pay more for everything, and it would be hard, and our quality of life would suffer unnecessarily, which is a real shame. Right.
Well, maybe we should move along to the energy situation, the electricity planning that's occurring right now. Maybe you could summarize that for us. I did have the chance to look at some modeling again, courtesy of Rob Parker. And what's planned sounds pretty extraordinary. If I have it correct, it's final deployments of 60 gigawatts of rooftop solar, 60 gigawatts of utility PV, 60 gigawatts of wind, 7 gigawatts of gas. There's a lot of 60s in there. Suffice it to say, that's a ton of renewables. I'm not sure the overall size of the Australian grid. I think it's something over 38 gigawatts. So maybe you do a better job than me sort of summarizing what's the plan. And then we'll get into sort of, what led your intuition to go, maybe this doesn't all stack up in terms of the cost claims. But first off, what is the plan?
Yeah. Australia's been coal-fired mostly for quite as long as back as I can remember looking at it. We have some gas. Actually, again, most of it's on the western export. We've plenty here too, but less of that's been developed recently. On the east coast, some governments have been sort of trying to put pressure on that. But we have so much coal, ridiculously good amounts of coal. So electricity is made with coal for as long as I've ever looked at it. And so only really in the last sort of 15, 20 years have people been actively trying to move away from that. And there's been some small gas power stations added to the system, but the big push in the last 10 to 15 years has been to sort of add more renewables. The plan that's been produced, that everyone's sort of following, the hymn book we're sort of all singing to, when I say we, not me personally, but Australia, is something that came out of the Finkel review. Had a chief scientist who kind of said, how do we make the grid sort of work with more renewables? And he commissioned, or he said that we should have more central planning of the transmission. So AEMO, our Australian Energy Market Operator, that normally run the live auctions to dispatch power best producer to the grid. They were given an expanded role to kind of think about how to plan transmission across the whole east coast of Australia. It's called the National Energy Market. It's really the east coast states plus South Australia, which is most Australian population. So that that's the AEMO ISP, and basically the AEMO ISP has been a plan to produce renewables. It's been a basically renewable centric plan, and that's not their fault. That's not a conspiracy. It's because Australians have fairly clearly indicated they want to go to decarbonise, and net zero is now an official policy. It was actually adopted by the Liberal government, so in a sense that's sort of bipartisan. So AEMO's done nothing wrong in the sense of trying to map out a renewables plan, because nuclear has been banned for quite a while in Australia. So that's the plan. And the plan at the moment, if I was to characterise the step change scenario that AEMO has, that's the most likely plan according to the latest ISP, integrated system plan that was produced. They have to risk mitigate a couple of other plans that map out different scenarios, but by far the most likely one that everyone talks about, this step change scenario, is basically to build a lot more rooftop solar, expand that 5 times, heaps more industrial scale, grid scale solar, heaps more wind, and then the thing that no one realises is the big thing that fills out the massive wedge there is a thing called distributed energy storage. So the vast majority of our firming capacity is assumed to be Powerwalls and Teslas that get plugged in from people's homes and dispatched to the grid, and that's the big thing about the step change plan. It basically assumes that we have about 45 gigawatts of dispatchable battery capacity, but it's all in people's homes and garages, and that, by the way, is not costed. There's no cost associated with that in the plan. And there's no cost with any of the distribution networks upgrades that are required to make that amount of batteries and all that flow between your neighbourhoods and whatever else. But that's the giant big. What's step change about? Step change is about batteries in your home that the consumers will buy. They are far, far bigger than the batteries in the grid, and they are far, far bigger than even the pumped hydro in the grid, by capacity at least. So that's what everyone should, when they hear AEMO step change, they should think, right, my car, my Powerwall, that's what step change is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it sounds like there's a love affair, as there are in many places in the world, and I think particularly on the left side of the political spectrum, with this idea of distributed energy resources. The economic analyses I've looked at, rooftop solar is far more expensive and less efficient than utility grade solar. So from a perspective of just basic economics and trying to, if you are going to subscribe to a renewables centric vision, rooftoping it seems like a more expensive way to get there. Or distributed battery storage versus centralized battery storage. Is that playing into this kind of national psyche and phobia surrounding large centralized industrial projects?
It's a really good question. I don't think it is playing too much in terms of people's phobia.
Do you just have a blackout?
The light switch again. Yeah, just 1 second.
For those of you listening, the lights just went out in Aidan's building, but I think it's just a timer.
I'm right back, and the lights are back. The lights are back on. So as far as people's reaction to kind of that decentralized versus centralized thing, I don't think people are too averse to centralized batteries. I mean, we don't know what they look like except for the cool one at Hornsdale, and there's been a couple more that have been added since. But no, I think there is a love affair with rooftop solar, and it's still the bit of the transition that is proceeding apace. People are still putting lots of rooftop solar on their roofs, and the problem with that, though, is that that's basically driven by a totally unsustainable economic pattern where we give people the right to have their power bills reduced in proportion to how much energy you save through your rooftop solar panel. But actually, most of your power bill, like more than half of it, is actually for the distribution network, the transmission network, and the energy retail. And you need the same amount of all those if you want to stay connected to the grid. So the maximum you should ever really be able to save, even if you had the biggest, best battery system that got you 99.9% with rooftop solar to having your own power, the maximum you should be able to economically save is about a third of your power bill. Wow. But you can save 80-90%, right? So you're incentivized quite strongly financially because the power companies still recoup all the distribution, or most of the distribution and transmission costs through your volume usage. The incentive is much, much bigger than the actual power that you save the grid. And the really problematic thing with that is that that means that all the power companies basically have to shift up their average prices to cover the fact they're not selling as much power to a bunch of customers, and particularly those customers, they're always buying power when the wholesale price is expensive, and they're never buying power when the wholesale price is its lowest, because solar is starting to really tilt the wholesale prices too in the market in Australia. So it's a weird situation. We've got this potential spiral, this feedback loop where the incentive to put a solar panel in your home gets higher the further the power prices go up. But the more people that put solar panels on their home, the higher the power companies have to raise their prices to cover the average cost of meeting all their needs. So yeah, rooftop solar is still growing apace because of that. But it's this incredible. I think it's a disastrous economic sort of feedback loop that we've set up. But it feeds into this idea that I think taps at people's heartstrings very closely, which is that, wow, I put that thing on my house, I can see it, it's feeding into my home, I'm taking demand off the grid. It's this kind of very, very warm, intuitive and tangible thing where people feel like they're doing their bit, and they feel like the economic reward, the financial reward they get is in proportion to that bit, which it's not. It's terribly out of proportion to that bit that they're doing there. But that sense, I think, is nurtured very strongly by the economic reinforcement you get from something that feels like you're doing a bit. But as you say, like literally 1 million tiny solar cells versus one big solar farm, like it's the worst in every sense, in economically engineering. No economies of scale, terrible to control. The grid operator can't see rooftop solar. They have to guess how much is there and what the impact is. They can't. It's just a demand that doesn't happen. But they've got very little visibility. And when a cloud goes over somewhere and a whole bunch drops out, it creates a nightmare for the grid. I mean, AEMO's being all chipper about it and saying, yeah, a new challenge to manage and we can do it, and maybe they can, but like it's of course it's the worst way to build solar if solar was the solution, but it's the only way that economically we've got the incentives set up to drive out really quickly. So it seems to be popular and it's rolling out at pace.
I was reading about an interesting event in South Australia, which I think has the most aggressive renewables percentages. And there was an intertie that was knocked out. Maybe my geography might be spotty here, but between Victoria and South Australia. Super sunny day, and the grid operator basically was telling everybody, try and disconnect your rooftop solar array and turn on every single appliance you possibly can to deal with this surge. Which is interesting, but just, again, we're going to get to the meat soon enough. There's been a lot of interest about the muckraking you've done, but just the context is so interesting. In terms of that distribution side of things, I mean, two questions here. Can the grid operator, are these rooftop-based systems controllable at all by the grid operator? And also in terms of this plan to have everybody buy a Tesla, which, is a big ask in terms of how much a Tesla costs. These are largely luxury vehicles, EVs, but the kind of distribution upgrades needed for a whole neighborhood to be dumping power back onto the grid in terms of a sort of two-way circuit with their batteries and rooftop solar. What's the state of things there in terms of distribution upgrades that are required? Is that sort of something that's discussed or costed in or factored?
Well, there's a clear answer in terms of AEMO's ISP, the Integrated System Plan. So the official document that is our roadmap of how to do this, it does not cost any of that. They absolutely stop at the transmission network. They do not cost any of the distribution network. It's just assumed. In fact, I found the table, and I'll share this, I think, in my next video, that shows them saying explicitly they assume the distribution network costs remain constant forever while we get to 99% EVs, and assume that those EVs can charge the grid whenever we need to. So there's crazy assumptions there. So AEMO doesn't. Is there any other discussion about it? Not very much publicly, but the distribution companies, and I've found, and people who follow me very closely to it might have noticed, but there are plans from the distribution companies. Basically, they're foreshadowing in their next kind of price raises. They're asking the regulators permission to increase their prices that they charge through the electricity bills in order to cover the costs of increased distributed energy resources. So these Teslas, these Powerwalls. So it is absolutely happening. They're relatively small increases, I think, across the power bill, like a few percent at the moment. But it will definitely accelerate as we get towards like that. If we get to 99%, we only have a few percent of EVs at the moment in Australia. So the writing's on the wall in terms of there will be costs. They are starting now. AEMO has ignored it 100%. That's not their jurisdiction or domains. They have not included that in any part of the plan. But just thinking about what it would require, because step change projects we get to 99% EV usage by 2050. Yeah, I think about that and I find it really amazing. I mean, I live in a suburb that's sort of medium-ish density urban area, and I live in an apartment. There's 15 apartments in our building, and we mostly have garages, but we park on the street because the garage is too small and too hard to get into. So lots of people in the eastern suburbs, for example, and lots of other parts of Australia too, they park on the street. So we couldn't charge an EV unless there's on-street parking as well. So you need to figure out, there needs to be a parking. Every garage needs to have a charger, and every apartment building has to have, every underground parking spot has to have a charger. And I've looked at the assumptions about when we're going to be charging. It won't be 65% of the time in step change. It's not at the convenient time for you, which is when you get home from work. 65% of the time, it's going to be pretty much when there's extra capacity in the grid, and they model it as that you can then soak up the extra wind and solar that's there. So I think that actually none of that will work very well at all if we don't have faster chargers, because the moment it takes to charge an EV, it's something like an hour will get you 15 kilometres, which is a trip to, I don't know, school and back or the office or whatever. But if you ever want to go further than that, you need a lot more than what you can charge per hour. So it's, to get a full charge, it's like a day or two, a couple of days, like it's continuous charging. So it makes sense to me that everyone at that kind of rate of charging would want to plug in as soon as they got home and start charging and not stop. And when it's fully charged, probably not have it discharge, because it takes you hours to get back anything more than a corner store trip. So I mean, I can imagine people being quite willing to try to contribute to the grid if it's incentivized and if it's possible. And I would think either you need to pay them something good for the risk that they're caught short, that their car might discharge all of a sudden and go back into the grid. And by the way, to discharge fast enough, I think you'll have to upgrade the grid to be able to discharge fast enough to help the grid meet those falls. But I think also you need to be able to charge. If I could charge my car in 4 or 5 hours, maybe I'd be much happier to say, well, let's leave it to start charging at 2 a.m. That'd probably work much better for me. But at the moment, so we're talking about stupendous distribution upgrades there to be able to have that degree of charging, I believe. I haven't tried to cost it at all, so take this with a grain of salt, but like these are big loads. Cars are more powerful than the other appliances in your house. So if everyone is doing that, and I mean, it's easy when there's only like a couple of % of the people doing it, but when everyone's doing that, this is going to change things a lot. And none of it's priced in Australia. None of it's priced in our master plan, the AEMO step change.
Okay, so you've been the sort of pesky thorn in the side of several of the major agencies that have been doing the modeling, CSIRO. Maybe we'll, I don't know that these acronyms are super important to disaggregate, maybe just the function of each of these institutions. But more interestingly to me, and maybe to the narrative here, is, again, kind of how you got interested and your intuitions, and, that led you beyond intuition into using your data science skills to actually deep dive these documents. But how did this all begin? I understand there was kind of a Twitter debate, and you started digging. But I want to get at this intuition. I think you talk about it in your video, which we're going to obviously link to. But walk me through that.
Yeah. So this was just a Twitter debate to start with, and I was debating with someone about the problem is that it'll get harder the more and more renewables we get, and the cost will start to increase. And I had an intuitive idea about how that must look, because as you put more and more renewables in the grid, more and more of the time you'll have too much at one place, and you'll have to move that energy further away. So you've got to move the energy somewhere once you've got too much in one place, or waste it. But that will increase the amount of transmission or storage. Either you've got to move the energy through space or through time. You can trade off those two, but you can't move the energy less far, and you'll need to move more and more and more of it. And the very, very last bits of that, as you start getting to the point where you've got like 80, 90%, you've got very, very rare pockets where you don't have enough energy. And so whenever you add more stuff, it never falls into those pockets. You've got to add stupid amounts more stuff to move it further and further to get that. So my intuition is a sort of a ski jump shape in terms of the resources required, the size of the system, pretty strongly. I think you could almost prove this mathematically. I don't think it's really disputable, really. And so I hadn't looked very deeply at any of the literature, but in one of these Twitter debates, someone came back at me and said, "Oh, of course we don't believe that. Of course we know It's going to go up, of course. But here's this graph from the CSIRO that shows you how much it's going to go up. And it's this nice little graph that just shows you these tiny, tiny little steps. It's almost flat and kind of perfectly monotone little steps in the increase of cost of renewables, meant to be at 60, 70, 80, 90% renewables. And I looked at that and I was baffled, and I said, oh, that can't be talking about the full cost. That must be just talking about maybe some spillage or something like that. And they said, no, look at the paragraph above. It says that it's the cost of integrated renewables, all the transmission, all the storage. And I was like, this makes no sense. And so I apologised, I think, quite politely and said, sorry, I didn't read the full thing, and went back and looked at it. And that's when I started later on looking at about page 50, how they define this. And page 50, they described their business as usual case, which was not included in the cost of integrating renewables. Business as usual included all the things that we had planned to build for our massive epic renewables transmission out to 2030. And we're meant to be at 82% renewables by 2030. So all the the biggest, most core trunk infrastructure projects, particularly to link our population centres in Melbourne and Sydney, which is a big part of our population, like maybe 40% of Australia's, and the Snowy Hydro 2.0 scheme, which is kind of halfway between, but way up in the mountains and off the coast. All the transmission to link the kind of coastal and flat inland solar and wind to the Snowy Hydro and Sydney is planned to be built in a hurry right now, before 2030. And the Snowy Hydro itself. That stuff is all excluded. And there's a whole bunch of batteries as well, like 8 gigs of batteries in New South Wales, and there's a bunch of other things as well. Oh, and there's a connection to Tasmania, another new pumped hydro scheme in Tasmania. So as an underwater cable DC tie called Mariners Link. So all the biggest, most headline trunk kind of core mega projects for renewables were excluded from this cost of integrating renewables. And the way that they justified that was just to say that it was, we're only looking at the marginal cost after 2030, and kind of arguing that basically because they'd already would have built that stuff at the time, the stuff that connected to them after that had nothing to do with the business case of actually justifying building that stuff. So just absurd, bizarre things. And yeah, that's how I kicked off. So I kind of noticed that and found it confirmed in an appendix. So everyone had just looked at the graph in the executive summary, it's sort of page 2 or 3 or something. And in page 50, it explained pretty clearly that they had missed out the lion's share of the heavy supporting infrastructure. And they confirmed it again, that was treated as a sunk cost in page 90. And so, yeah, I came out swinging and wrote back. And no one, I mean, and the rest is history, but no one has been able to respond and say you got it wrong. In fact, the chief energy economist at the CSIRO, after it got picked up in the paper, wrote back and confirmed that they indeed had not included any of those costs. Other people were trying to argue that maybe some trick of the wording meant they had included those costs, but he confirmed in the national newspaper they had not included all the costs up to 2030, and said, "Oh, that's fine. It's the ISP's job to do that." And of course, the ISP doesn't include any of the distribution network upgrades, any of the battery storage in your homes, doesn't include Snowy Hydro 2 as well, because that's something that they've already started building. So they just don't include that. So, and it's crystal clear there just hasn't been clarity of communication, because Paul Graham from the CSIRO, Chief Energy Economist of the CSIRO, he said that it is the job of the ISP to do the full cumulative system costs up to 2030. But yet, in the details, the ISP, because things like Snowy Hydro 2 are assumed in all scenarios, they're an exogenous input, they're not testing the transmission plan around, they actually don't include that too. So it's 100%, like there's a perfect gotcha there. There's no wriggle room. He said that included the full cumulative cost. AEMO clearly does not, and that's been confirmed in correspondence to Claire in the Australian too. So they don't include the Snowy Hydro. It's in neither. This massive big mega project that justifies these huge high voltage lines between Sydney and Melbourne and all the renewables areas around it, that is not included in the cost of either document. It's madness, and we have been lied to a bit by Paul Graham in that sense in his letter to the Australian newspaper.
I mean, what always strikes me as interesting, beyond Australia, with the renewables intensive plans and renewables advocates, that there's not an evidentiary base that this works. So it relies heavily, exclusively on modeling. But in Australia, maybe it's as a function of being an isolated continent, you don't hear a lot. I mean, there's a diversity of modeling studies. They tend to come from institutions that have a significant, I think, buy-in, and there's some ideological blinders, which probably skew the modeling. But even, modeling from the States, I see, Net Zero America saying, having some clean firm is going to, decrease your overall costs. But again, in Australia, it seems like there's this kind of oracle on the mountain, and it may be several different institutions. But the degree of, I'll call it, pseudo-religious faith in these institutions and in the modeling, I found to be totally extraordinary. Failure to plan is planning for failure. But if you're not even considering the possibility of failure and having any kind of plan B there, that seems to be a big problem to me. I think you always need to sort of red team your ideas. And maybe you can comment before we get into more details about that phenomenon. I think this kind of faith that's placed in these institutions, more broadly within, Australian society, within the political class, within media. To me, this seems like a bold experiment, a highly consequential one if it doesn't work out. But there's, a real lack of considering the what ifs and a faith that it's all going to go fine because, these institutions are telling you so.
So I've come to this debate, very quickly, quite recently, but it hasn't been on my radar to follow this very closely and sort of really critique the cultural take on this. Honestly, more than a year ago, right? I haven't been very closely following the kind of how they're regarded, and even probably a few months ago, if you told me AEMO's ISP says this, I would have assumed that it was the authority and very good on that. So I wasn't aware of this kind of the degree. I think you as a foreigner have unique insight into the degree to which we have this oracle on the mountain. For us, it's the only place you'd look, right? Because we're an island, and we don't. I mean, if you're in Europe, for example, there's a dozen different countries with their own universities and institutions and power managers and whatever else, and different ways of doing things. There'd be easy neighbours to compare to. We don't really have that so much, and we are an island in that sense. And the other thing is, we're an island at the moment that is. I think that Australians have become quite seized of concern around climate change. There's a bit of a split. There's a part. It was possible for quite a while for Australian politicians to not be that concerned about it and not do something for quite a while. But I think the gravity has shifted in Australia, and now it's kind of politically assumed that we do care about that and we need to do something about it. And this is the weird thing about. If nuclear is banned in Australia and you're quite seized of the need to go and sort of remove all the carbon from your electricity network, you don't really have any options. And in a way, I kind of have a forgiving moment for AEMO for being kind of well, what would you do if you were the agency who was charged with delivering a clean transition in Australia and the other option was banned? You'd have to put on a pretty smiley face and, grit your teeth and say, let's go do this, right? What are the other things? Come back and say, oh, no, it's too hard for me. You don't keep your job in the public service or make any friends with your sort of political masters by saying that. So in a sense, I feel like just having removed and banned any competition from the table has meant that we have to have faith that it can be done. And it's kind of blinded us to kind of critical thinking about whether there's even a different way, because we've sort of silenced the voices in a sense. And now it's sort of weird. I've been encountering this, rapidly connected to this nuclear movement, a bunch of people that are, underground sort of rebels in Australia, but there's a lot of them. There's a whole bunch that are extremely accomplished in a whole bunch of fields and engineering and business and etc. But they're the ones, and we're total outsiders and not given a lot of airtime and attention, and certainly not from the institutions. And I guess they have an excuse because this is not even legal. AEMO can just write back and say, yeah, we don't cost illegal things in Australia. Therefore, our baseline that shows that this transition is cheap is trying to do a renewables transition without any transmission, and that does look quite expensive because it's all offshore wind next to your cities and carbon capture and storage for gas plants and things that are even more kind of wildly expensive. But so it's sort of, I think a big part of it might have come from the fact that we're isolated, but also when you take out any alternatives to investigate, it's very easy to develop this kind of dogmatic faith that you just have to do it, right? It's just, you didn't choose this war is coming. You have to believe you can win, right? So so I suppose I think we seize upon the sources of truth that affirm what we want to hear, which is that we can win. And yeah, I think it's really bad. It's only just starting to crumble a little bit at the edge quite recently. But up until very recently, CSIRO, and even still, like Chris Bowen's still at it. So far, he hasn't for the last few days, but even weeks ago, after I'd released plenty of information, come out in newspapers, was still repeating. In fact, he'd gone out of his way to pretty much write new newspaper articles in the Fin Review, in the Australia. He'd gone out of his way to write editorials that pretty much said, trust in AEMO, trust in CSIRO, this is still the cheapest, even though the basis for that had already been extremely credibly critiqued. He just came out and said, just said, one more time, please. AEMO and CSIRO have said this is the cheapest, therefore it's the cheapest. Let's go. And I think that's just really disappointing politics. I mean, he shouldn't get away with it, and I don't think he will in the long run. We've got another year or two to the next election, but that's what happens in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to tell this story and your role in it as a children's fairy tale, it would be the emperor is not wearing any clothes, and you are the young player who is pointing that out. And it looks like Bowen is like, yes he is, check out those duds, they're pretty sexy. But I think what you're saying, there's the reason that this is coming from outsiders is, talking to some folks who help manage the grid, and it's getting to be a very complex system. And I won't name any names, obviously, but there's I think an understanding that this is a huge challenge and that it may not work out. But it's not a sort of career advancing move to raise the concerns that you're raising. And again, in terms of that unwillingness to consider the possibility of failure on a psychological basis, I think that really comes from the idea that climate change is going to be so cataclysmic. There is no option for failure. We can't fail, and we'll do whatever it takes to make this work. And as you're saying, if you narrow the options to wind, solar, and batteries only, that leaves you in a bit of a predicament. But again, I think there's a lot of I think energy is deeply aesthetic. In terms of what we were talking about before, the kind of distributed versus centralized. But our ideas around energy transition are obviously deeply kind of psychologic and again related to that framing that climate change gives us, that we just can't fail. So let's not even consider that or red team it. I'm not sure your thoughts on that, but
yeah, I think that's true. The other thing to think about really carefully though is that how I suppose the institutions and the industry people and the people that have expertise, like what are the incentive structures that are set up for them? It's sad if it's the case that in AEMO or the other official institutions, you might lose your job or not get promoted because you're holding outsider views that, we should do nuclear. I have reason to believe that might be the case actually, which is sad. But even just thinking about, let's take AEMO out of the picture. Let's assume that there, something might have gone wrong there. But if you think about, if AEMO gets it wrong or doesn't handle it, what are the other institutions or capabilities that kind of end up just getting stuff done, right? Like, if we have to keep the grid running. And I think that a fair bit of the talent lies in the private sector, maybe the regulated parts of the private sector, but the people that are actually running the transmission systems and building the transmission lines and keeping the grid stable from that perspective, there's maybe more, there's smart people there, I'm sure. But what are the incentives there in these other kind of talent pools or people that run generators or have been installing generators? The incentive structures there aren't necessarily for you to speak out either, because transmission and distribution, they're regulated assets. So saying that we need a whole bunch more of this stuff right now, it kind of suits them really. It seems to suit them quite well. Like, I suspect they know how hard it is. But making your job harder, provided you are guaranteed enough money to be paid to keep doing it, is not bad for you personally, and not bad for the business you work for either. So I think there has to be really clear. It is a problem which you must consider, is that the emperor really has no clothes, and we just haven't had the motive, if you like, for enough people to really start speaking loudly enough with enough authority. And I have no credibility. Like, to be honest, I haven't used any of my data science skills yet. I just read to page 50 and page 90 and wrote about it on Twitter, right? Like, and I opened some Excel spreadsheets, but that's nothing seriously data sciencey in any of the stuff that's made it to the public. Some data science stuff that I tend to do, but it's nothing's required yet. It just requires, I suppose, I don't know, literacy and numeracy and a bit of backbone to speak up. But I think the people that have the most need to be diving into the detail, actually that's what I have done. I've dived in a bit further than most people have, and are familiar and confident enough to speak about that. And maybe I'm just, I don't know, an odd character that's happy to speak up about something that I'm not qualified in. But the people that should be qualified enough, they're not necessarily incentivized to speak loudly, which is an issue. So yeah, we could not have contemplated failure, and possibly because all the backsliding and all the things that would catch us from the bits of failure we might have, it looks relatively profitable to lots of the institutions and organisations that might end up, just handling it. If we have to keep the grid running that way. So, yeah, it's been totally under contemplated. There are people starting to make noises now, but in terms of the credible things, the press, the politicians. I think the extent, and that's the problem with the renewables transition, right? Things don't break all at once. Like in a nuclear power plant, if something goes wrong, you generally shut down, and if something was badly wrong, then you generally have the regulators crawling all over you for ages to make sure that you've definitely fixed it right. But if something is not designed right, it doesn't go together right in the renewables transition, it just gets less efficient. It just gets more expensive. Like someone just pays a bit more. We decarbonize more slowly. We waste some more energy. We just turn on some more gas. There's nothing catastrophic that might even trigger a serious degree of, I don't know, introspection or repentance. The costs are kind of diffused, the blame. There's so many different layers of institutions and organizations and regulation and government. So, and that's what I'll be looking more at for my next video, hopefully. But I think it turns out that many of these business cases and things that we're very sure of are actually paper thin, or maybe should have gone the other way quite significantly. But there's been no trigger for pushing back and reevaluating. Like once a project has a bit of momentum behind it, everyone just wants to get it done. All the people that are smart around it are about to make money by doing this thing. No one wants to kind of say, oh, actually, this doesn't make any sense anymore. That will move energy in the wrong direction. This will probably mean that we end up paying more for this electricity, or that power's not going to be available there to offset the lull here anymore. Generally, once it's got a degree of momentum behind it, the industry just supports it through, I think. And there's some real cases where Australians need to, we could have much more on this later, but there's some disasters unfolding. There really are. And in fact, I'll just say quickly that all of the Snowy Hydro, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that the whole Snowy Hydro scheme should be built now at all, or any of the transmission to and from. I think that it's in both documents just assume it's there. And all the transmission projects, they work if it's there and we have to connect to it. But this whole thing that kind of pretty much has been the central piece of our whole East Coast grid planning, I don't think that it's necessarily obvious that the whole grid doesn't work better, cheaper, even for renewables, without it there. And I think that it's possible that just has not been tested in any of the official institutions right now.
I mean, it seems like what you're describing, it's analogous in terms of the kind of, not necessarily institutional capture, but this kind of self-licking ice cream cone element of it to the military industrial complex. I think, to coin a term, maybe we have a modeling industrial complex here. There's definitely plenty of funds that flow towards academic institutions and government institutions to continue to study an increasingly complex and difficult problem. But, leaving that aside, I wanted to jump back again to some of the framings that you have in your video. And again, we're going to have that linked in the show notes. But I thought you had, some really poignant ways of putting things. And one of the analogies I liked, and again, this gets back to, I feel like there's a lot of gaslighting coming from the renewabilists. But no, of course, this all makes sense. You just don't lack the skills to understand this. Have you opened Appendix, 32 and poured through that? And I mean, there's a beauty to going through the source literature, but there's some basic kind of intuitions that I think are off. So, tell me a little bit about this framing you have of the irrigation versus scuba. because I thought that was an interesting way, again, in terms of broad first principles of understanding why this whole thing is so difficult and so expensive in terms of a renewable centric transition.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that was, I think, a useful analogy. Like, just to think about how energy falls in a renewable sense. Like, it just falls in splashes and splotches across the landscape, like rain or wind. And the analogy I use is that would be okay if we absorbed energy like a crop needs rain, right, or something like that. And to that extent that you don't need any right now, you don't need any tomorrow, but so long as you get enough overall over a good period of time, over a season or something like that, then things are all okay. But you have no particular fuss about exactly where and when it lands. That's to me is kind of how that's how renewables work. We're collecting the energy as it falls freely and over the landscape in these patterns we can't control, and it would match a consumption pattern of like a plant needing water. So I kind of describe the kind of collection process of like an irrigation system of kind of like, we'll get it and we'll kind of just pull it all together so we can get enough of it eventually to the right place. And my contrast, and this is kind of like why I think that renewables aren't necessarily good for certainly human domestic powering, is that we need electricity not in that kind of pattern, but we need electricity like a mammal or an animal needs air. Like, we need exactly the right amount all the time, sometimes more than others, but we need, if we don't have exactly the right amount, things get desperate in seconds. And so, the renewables issue, it's not that the actual solar panels and wind farms are expensive. They can be very, very cheap, but they're just the collection part of that system. The energy has to be delivered in a manner that matches this oxygen delivering, give me exactly the right amount for my breath right now, which I call the scuba system. So it's the problem with renewables is not that they're not cheap to have the actual wind farms and solar panels. They can be as cheap as you like. It's that you have to have all this machinery to then collect it in that frame, that kind of way, and then deliver it in this every second your breath depends on this kind of scuba system. So it's the irrigation to scuba connection, the irrigation to scuba mashup of machinery. That's what makes renewables hard. How do you deliver it in such a precise way that you need every second when it's collected in such this abstract, dispersed kind of fluid flowing, unpredictable manner? So that's why it's hard, and I think that's the bit of the system people don't cost. We never have before because we've never had electricity produced produced is the wrong word. We shouldn't even call them generators. Can I propose just to everyone here, like let's not call solar and wind farms generators. That's an active verb that implies that you are controlling what you do, right? And that's not what they do. I call them, the best word I come up with, spitball another one if you want, Chris, but I call them collectors, right? They are finding energy that occurs in the landscape and they're picking up what they can find. But they don't have control over that. It's fundamentally a kind of a foraging process. It's not making something like an industrial process where you say, start producing X and go and produce it, which is what you can do with thermal power plants. So this kind of passive collection will get what we find out there, approach to energy. They call it generation, but it's not, it's collection. It requires this whole other system to then convert it to this life-giving, steady stream like we need every breath, every moment. That's the expensive bit, and that's the transmission, and that's the storage, and that's why I think this the renewables transition is not nearly as cheap as everyone has commonly thought about it. Yeah,
right, or even possible in terms of the highly consequential matter of delivering energy like oxygen. Another thing from the video I really liked was how you're explaining that early deployment of wind and solar within an existing traditional energy framework, it's fairly easy because you're just sort of fuel sparing and dialing down this underlying reliable generation system, as you were saying. But then as you start to blow up those coal plants or get to a certain point in renewables penetration, then you can't just rely on that backup network to float the whole society when you have not even a black swan event, but when the weather doesn't cooperate for an extended period. I did have a really interesting discussion with a staffer from Chris Bowen's office, and we had a sort of battle of the incubators. I was bringing up how I view the grid as a civilizational life support structure, and I think what made that very personal and poignant to me was the fact that my son was in an incubator for 5 weeks. And, imagining an electrify everything world that's run with collectors and this kind of Rube Goldberg machine attempting to turn irrigation into scuba, that's consequential. And again, it's a way that, it bites right at the core of my being. I get emotional talking about it. And the staffer was like, oh yeah, well, my child was in an incubator for 8 weeks. And I'm like, well, does it not concern you? I mean, again, just open your mind to the idea that this might not all work out. You might end up with a highly unreliable grid. And he's like, well, that's why hospitals have generators. And, I've worked in a hospital. We had a road crew that ended up digging up our grid connection, and we went on to diesel backup. I mean, that's a pretty traumatic experience for the people responsible within the hospital for getting that system up and going. We did some load shedding. Interestingly, our vending machine still had power, but certain areas were shut down. Power was off there. And, hospitals are not as robust as nuclear stations in terms of defense in depth. And, just the kind of callousness with which he said, yeah, well, blackouts will happen, but, we have our critical infrastructure like our hospitals is back. Don't worry about it. We'll have the diesel for it. I just found to be, just utterly, utterly shocking and irresponsible. So yeah, I'm just kind of.
I'd agree.
Yeah. Okay, what else did I have here? One other point that's brought up often is, well, it's always windy or there's always sunshine somewhere. And again, the staffer also made that point with me. I did point out, and I should try and forward along the data I had if I can find that person's email. Rob Parker was showing me some periods on the NEM. Again, that very thin East Coast transmission system for those unfamiliar with the Australian context, where there have been prolonged periods of minimal sun and wind. But yeah, I think you had a good response to that in the video as well. Just want to riff off some of what I felt were the highlights of the video. Yeah. But how do you respond to that? It's always sunny or windy somewhere. Why is that not a solution to this whole problem?
Yeah, I call it this statement that's perfectly true and absolutely useless. Because to make it useful to have some wind somewhere, you need to have enough wind or sun somewhere to power somewhere, right? Wherever that is, you still need to power whatever that is, and you need to have enough to power everywhere else as well. And you need to have the transmission to get that power to everywhere else as well. It's the most ludicrous idea. Because there's a little bit somewhere, everywhere's fine, and that's all good. It just means you have to have this ridiculous idea of the overbuild at that location, so that it's got spare capacity for what it needs there, and to send everywhere else, and the capacity to move it there. It's like this. It's this perfect image of just not having thought through, how real energy works at all. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I honestly, anyone, if you've said that before, just don't say it again. It just sounds so stupid. It is true. It is just so useless to think that, because it's sunny somewhere, that means we'll have power everywhere.
Right.
Imagine what you have to do to make that the case,
These feel like... These feel like such truisms, and they don't require a massive amount of modeling or analysis. They feel like they're just common sense, but they almost feel like weaker arguments up against this kind of modeling industrial complex. But go ahead. Sorry. Yeah,
let me riff just a little bit further. I mean, I think that a popular perception that people have is that the grid is kind of like, once something goes in the grid, it's sort of everywhere in the grid. It's sort of a super connected thing, right? And essentially, I think it's a real problem that what we call the copper plate model, the infinite transmission model, is that if it goes in the grid, it's everywhere, right? Like the grid connects it all, right? That unfortunately, I think to the layperson, that's actually where they start. They think that the grid is like that. And then a bunch of people that should know better, that are kind of professional, make models that pretend the grid is like that. We have this kind of weird axis of deception between the least informed people and the most informed people that seem to have an agenda to push to kind of say, yeah, it'll all work if we just kind of, model everything as if it's a copper plate. But people don't realize that actually the amount of interconnection that you have between two big regions like, South Australia or Victoria or New South Wales, or in Europe, right? Like between different countries or under certain seas, the amount of connection that you have is generally something in the order of a gigawatt. Sometimes it's 2 or 3, sometimes it's a half or a third of a gigawatt, but this is enough to replace a big power station, a power station, not the whole state, not the whole country. A thought experiment I actually had over breakfast the other morning that I would love to actually make a real experiment is to figure out, like, if a country lost all its power, what fraction through the interconnectors of its power could it get from all its neighbours if it had enough, if all the neighbours had enough power to give them for free? And I think that people don't realise that it's not actually a very big fraction. Like, these are meant to support a relatively small top-up that you might need. It's never meant to support like half or most of that whole country or state's power. So moving powering Victoria from Queensland is strictly impossible, like nowhere near. And nothing we're contemplating building will get us anywhere near being able to do that, right? So, I just think unfortunately, this copper plate model it's an intuitive first place. The grid connects it all, right? It's completely connected. Like the internet connects us all. We are all completely connected.
Right.
It's not true. It's not true for power. It's got a capacity. It's got a bandwidth limit. I think these copper plate models, like, again, I wish that people were ashamed of producing them and using them to draw the conclusions they do. They're still not. It's strange, but it's just such a far from reality approximation, and it reinforces this really quite intuitive but not right perception that people that have no information in the space kind of take with them all the time as a starting point.
Denmark might be the closest country to a copper plate. We had a conversation with, I think it's Jonas Legrand, I might be messing up his last name, but they have more intertie capacity than power generation capacity in country. It's just ridiculously connected with it. But anyway, that's definitely not the situation in Australia.
That could be true.
So the other talking point that came up in my debate on Channel 7, I'm blanking on the guy's name, highly accomplished Order of Australia type guy. But you hear this a lot. Australia has the best, wind and solar resources in the world. I think, the Simon Holmes Accord, vast areas that are windswept and sun drenched, and huge open plains in which to deploy this tech, and that this gives Australia, an advantage. It was really interesting, the concession from a lot of the anti-nuclear folks that, hey, nuclear works great elsewhere. It just won't work in Australia because our resources are it's such a concession. I found that really interesting. They were willing to make that, given where the anti-nuclear debate was at. It'll mutate your children or whatever, 5, 10, 15 years ago. But
exactly.
in terms of, the capacity factors in Australia, do you have a sense of like how much better they are? I mean, clearly solar is far better in Australia than Europe. But I mean, I imagine Arizona is pretty analogous. Is there something that's so special about Australia? And with regards to this idea of, kind of a land without a people for a people with lots of wind and solar, how true is that in terms of, how people are feeling in rural areas around hosting this stuff?
Yeah, I hear it all the time. Exactly as you described it is exactly how I would describe it. Like, this concession that, nuclear maybe, but we have such good renewable resources. We couldn't. It would never
almost here. As if wind turbines and solar panels sprout like plants out of the ground, right? Like
that would be the impression. That would be the impression you get, right? But no. To answer the real question, I want you to entertain that idea. Imagine if, and this is sort of my answer to why that's not a compelling advantage, right? Imagine if wind and solar panels were not cheap; they were free. Imagine they sprouted out of the ground. Literally, they just kind of popped up, and we had so much space; they were just everywhere. Why would our electricity not be free? And the answer is that we still have the rest of the machinery to get it from the irrigation system to the scuba system to build, right? Like, it doesn't matter how much we have. We can have any amount of free solar panels and wind turbines out in wherever they are, and I'll get to that in a sec. We still have to connect them up and make sure that energy is kind of pooled and aggregated in a way that delivers it in the nice, steady moments. We need it into our population centers and cities. So I actually don't think that it's I think it's silly. It's intuitive. Again, it's a first cut kind of like quick knee-jerk, most intuitive thing to say. We got lots of it, right? Therefore, it's good. We can just use this. Having lots of a thing, the thing that you have lots of is this sploshy, splashy kind of intermittent energy. That's not the thing that you need. You need the steadily delivered kind of energy, right? So you've got lots of a raw material. Like, imagine we got lots of iron ore. We should have great steel, right? No? we don't, because we need the coking coal at the other side of the country, and you got to move it around, right? So it's just as simple as that. Like, what, we've got one of the raw but very cheap inputs to what we actually need. We don't have the rest. That's not free. We still have to build it. And in fact, when you look at the issue with Australia, like, we've got so much land that we don't use, such abundant land, like we're not space constrained. Actually, Australians have already found economical ways of utilising that relative abundance of land, and we have relatively lots of agriculture, so like out to a very, there's not, in Victoria, it's very full, we grow wheat, if you go 100k inland, there's still lots of wheat country, so the amount of space we're kind of like generally ours, there's nothing else to do with this little land, there's no other competing options, is you got to go a long way inland to get to kind of there is nothing going on here, no production. And then if you want to get that power to the cities, it's a really long way away, right? So you tend to build things, and if you look at the renewable zone mapping that Australia has in the ISP, the renewable zones are these kind of oblong, not oblong, oval, elongated oval kind of ellipse shapes that are meant to have a transmission line going through the guts of them, I assume. But they're big, and there's lots of them, and they're kind of everywhere except within about 100k of the city. I think they've figured out that land's too expensive there, but they kind of cover most of the east coast of Australia. There's a zone somewhere on the map to be planned in the next sort of 20, 30 years. So the plan is to build everywhere along the east coast in land that does have other uses we've already figured out. And this is what I think we're starting to realise, is that, you've got to go and clash with a lot of farming communities, a lot of agricultural communities, and say, hey, we want lots of this space. We want big power lines down here. And it's starting to annoy people. I think that's what's starting to kind of ignite a bit more of the sort of resistance to renewable move out. But we have figured out uses for lots of our land. The land that we haven't figured out any uses for is miles away. And all that abundant energy is just a very cheap raw material input to produce the kind of energy we actually need and consume in our society. And we still have to add all the other things that we need to make it that actual usable system. So it doesn't matter if we have literally solar panels sprouting out of the ground in our unused vast landscapes for free, because we still need to connect it. And that's what I think, that's what I think unfortunately means that nuclear in Australia is still the best low-carbon energy option, even though we have all this abundant raw resources. Finishing it, just like our coal and iron ore, we can't finish it and make steel, much of it. The raw inputs aren't very important in the scheme of things. You have to have the rest of it and advantage in them too.
So I'll freely admit to having a psychological bias towards a little bit of catastrophism. I thought COVID was going to be far worse than it was. My brother was more on the sort of Y2K is going to crash society. I didn't jump on that train. So I'm aware of cognitive biases and the need to challenge them. After that meeting with the Bowen staffer, and, that was just the day before we left Australia, it almost felt like I was getting off of a sinking ship. And clearly things are going to move in much slower tempo, and there's some ability to absorb pain within such a wealthy society that still has, such a valuable set of export commodities. But I really had a premonition that things were heading in a pretty dangerous direction. Just to get your sense, how do you see the next 10, 15 years going in terms of this energy transition and its consequences, and the prospects for nuclear? Make that kind of a closing question, I guess. Big question. But give me your sense of where you see things going.
Look, I'm not a catastrophizer. I think I maybe have the opposite bias, not sure, but I'm relatively kind of I don't know, just at peace. Even if there's a catastrophe, I think I can kind of just try to calmly kind of slide into it without too much excitement, agitation, perhaps, maybe. But I'm not. I think that Australia will be nuclear at some point in the next few decades. The question is really what it takes to get us there. Actually, that's not perfectly true. There's a chance that we may just still stumble and wind up just with lots of coal still. That's a possibility as well. And so I hope that it changes really soon, and that we wake up and realise that nuclear is the only thing that kind of finishes the decarbonisation race, and we should start it straight away so that we can finish the decarbonisation race quite soon. But in the next few years, there's an absolutely critical, like we are absolutely at the fork in the road where we've reached sort of 35-40% renewables, where right now we're about to start figuring out whether we want to keep going to very high levels of renewables. And to do that, we, at some point, need to start building these huge amounts of infrastructure and storage. And we've already started building some of them, right? So Snowy Hydro 2.0, and we've started with Energy Connect and this HumeLink, VNI West. These are the big trunk transmission lines. And I think there's a huge question about whether they happen, because they will cost billions, a good number of billions, Marinus Link as well. And I think we're on a tipping point where we could wind up like Germany, with just having waltzed into higher, much, much higher power prices that do affect what industries we can support and do affect quality of life and standard of living. I don't know how far down the German path you have to go before you come back. And Germany's an amazing experiment to kind of see where that leads, right? But they absolutely have, they've engineered it. They just haven't realised that it's not coming back down. The prices, it gets harder and harder, and the prices will stay high and get higher again. I hope we don't go too far down that route. I hope we realise that adding, more or less replacing our coal fleet with nuclear is about the right thing to do. And renewables are not that harmful in a grid so long as they're not harmful. They're not that economically disastrous to have that not that helpful thing in the grid at around about the percentages we currently have them. But we're about to tip over the brink of putting enormous investments that are only useful for supporting renewables. And they definitely will be added to our regulated asset base, and we'll have to pay for them somehow. So I have this sense of trepidation about what happens in the next year or two or three, what happens in the next ISP, Integrated System Plan, because all of the, and this is a bit of a spoiler, but all of the projects that are now being rushed as the most urgent priorities, the true economic analysis in the ISP said that was absolutely on a knife edge, according to their numbers, and there was no real need to rush them at all, and they could have been left to the next one a couple of years later. But they're being rushed now, and I think the narrative has taken hold that we have to keep rushing them, and actually we don't need to rush them. It's only economically in the interests really of the renewables investors, because they'll get less curtailment, they'll get better dispatch to the grid, they'll have a better return on their investment. So in terms of the overall thing, us having to pay a little bit more to more curtailed renewables operators is probably borderline no worse than us paying a little bit more for massive big transmission lines. In fact, with new numbers, it's probably much better. But we haven't realised that, and we're on the tipping point of now committing to these enormous mega projects that we would never need if we had nuclear in the system. But we're buying them now. We're committing to them now. So it's a fork in the road. And I do worry about our lifestyles and our standard of living taking an unnecessary hit, because we just... it'll gain so much momentum. We will do another 5, 10, 15 years, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment, and it will be more or less wasted once we finally turn around and go nuclear, which I think will happen at some point. There'll be a revolt at some point. There will be a Germany at some point too, I think. But yeah, the next year is crucial. People don't realise where we stand on that stuff, and I think that I really hope we wake up and walk back and can these transmission projects, which won't get us to full decarbonisation and won't do anything at all if we decarbonise through nuclear.
Well, as a climate hawk, I hate to say this, mate, but long may your coal stations hold up. In terms of just propping up this grid.
Indeed.
I mean, that was
sadly.
That was, I think that was, again, from the Bowen staff, a key thing was just like, nuclear would have to be ready in time for our end of life with our coal stations, and not just, the sort of, strictly speaking, premature end of life of the climate imperative, but also just the physical end of life of these stations that I believe are mostly built in the 80s. The timing of a coal to nuclear transition is pretty sensitive in terms of, being able to fit something in, both for the stability of your grid and also for the lives of those communities and workers who depend on those assets and on having something to replace coal in their communities. But
Well, I just hope that the staffer is like actually kind of weighing up the costs of closing that little gap with, I don't know, some cheap, quick gas plants or something like that, because the costs we're about to sink into the enabling infrastructure for renewables and closing the gaps between, every cloud blowing over and every sunset and every lull in the wind is just absolutely profound. So I tend to look at those kind of, what will it take to keep coal running? What will it take to close the gaps with something else in between? And say, if we need to plug some gaps there, we probably can still and should do it, because if you weigh up the costs of doing that compared to what we are about to spend on the renewables transmission, etc., it still might look very, very cheap, very, very good value. So, I think that we will get there eventually anyway, and the lifetime of a particular coal plant won't matter a dime in terms of what the right policy is, because the end state, I think, is relatively clear as the one that's sustainably, economically low carbon.
Okay, Aiden, I could talk to you for hours. This is one of the longer couple episodes. It's been a lot of fun. Everybody hop over to YouTube. Mill Tech and Tack. Is that tic-tac-toe? What's the...
Yep. It's Mill Tech and Tack, MILTECHNTAC, Mill Tech and Tack. It's for military technology and tactics, which is it's a shortening of those words, which is a interest area of mine for many years. But yeah, that's the channel I had. Awesome. And started launching into this stuff on that.
And give Aiden a follow at Quixotic Quant on Twitter. One of the most underfollowed people, I think, compared to the quality of your output. So get on that as well, Chris. Folks. And Aiden, I'm sure we'll have you back at some point in the near future. Thanks for staying up late to get this done.
Cheers, Chris. Really good to talk to you.
All right. Bye for now.